Well, good morning. This is Ian R. Crane. It's the morning of Wednesday, the 3rd of October, 2018. And for the last time this week, I'm up on Epsom Downs before I head back down to the southwest, ready to do episodes of Humanity vs. Insanity and Fracking Nightmare tomorrow evening. Humanity vs. Insanity, my guest will be Dr. Graham Downing. That'll go out on UK Column Live at 7:30, and then Fracking Nightmare at 9 o'clock. So just in case I forget to say it at the end, no live stream tomorrow morning, but back on Friday. Well, as I speak, the truly awesome lock-on at Preston New Road is still underway. This is a lock-on that kicked off the early hours of Monday morning. And now this lock-on is despite early hours of Monday morning. And now this lock-on is despite the fact that it's in the injuncted area. And the lock-on, of course, is a reaction to two things. It's a reaction primarily to the jailing of Rich Loiseau, Simon Blevins and Richard Roberts last Wednesday for their epic lorry surf back in July 2017. And of course, they have been jailed for 16 and 15 months. So these peaceful protesters get 15 and 16 months in jail for what I believe to be a first offence. Meanwhile, Judge Robert Oldham allows pedophiles to walk free from his court. There are at least two cases, one of Jeffrey Taylor in September 2016, and then again Keith Harley in June 2017. Both were found with Category A paedophile pornography on their computers, and yet they walk free with a suspended sentence. And in fact, I believe on Monday, there was a judge's parade through the centre of Preston, and extra police had to be drafted in when taunts from the crowd were calling the parade of judges pedophile protectors. Well, people are starting to realise that there's something wrong, and there will definitely be something wrong if Quadrilla get their way and are able to frack before the end of the month. And of course, Francis Egan is basically bragging to the media that basically any day now the frack pumps will be fired up, and Quadrilla will effect the first frack in the UK since the moratorium was lifted in December 2012. And of course, that moratorium was put in place because of Quadrilla's causing the seismic events following an attempt to frack their well at Priest Hall back in 2011. So, of course, it's not over yet. The frack spread is still being configured, but it is borrowed time. But as you know, he's often said, it ain't over till it's over. And the fat lady may actually be about to leave her dressing room, but she hasn't yet broken into song. So anything could happen. And of course, even if Quadrilla are able to frack, the likelihood is that it will go wrong, that there will be unintended consequences, which will not just lead to a further moratorium, but will lead to calls for an outright ban. And of course, this is now what many Tory MPs actually want. They realise that this is a massive millstone with everything else that they're having to deal with right now. And of course, Theresa May in particular, fighting to hang on to her hold of number 10. They really need this fracking millstone like the proverbial hole in the head. And as Lee Rowley said at a fringe meeting, fracking is like a barnacle on the bottom of the Conservative ship, and it needs to be removed. And of course, this is the message that's being sent to the government through parish councils, district councils, county councils, and their MPs, that this attempt to make exploratory drilling permitted development is backfiring massively, or maybe not, as the case might be, of course. But there is almost unanimous rejection of this proposition. So if the government does try and push ahead by making exploratory drilling planned development, then the likelihood is that there will be a massive backlash. But maybe that's what not Claire Perry, quite the opposite. Claire Perry can't actually think for herself, but it's what Greg Clark and James Brockenshire actually want, because I believe that they are tasked with creating a strategy whereby public reaction is so strong that there is actually no option but to pull the plug on this industry, and they're hoping, I think, that the industry pulls the plug on itself. Well, that's happening little by little. And late last night, my good friend Benjamin Dean posted that iGas had relinquished their PEDL license, that's Petroleum Exploration and Development License 188, which is the license to the south of Chester, centred around Farndon and Holt. And of course, this was where iGas drilled an exploratory well, I think back in 2014, and have never returned there. So I'm guessing that they didn't actually get what they were hoping for from the core samples. So that's good news for the people to the south of Chester. They are no longer under threat from iGas. But of course, the same can't be said for the communities around Ellesmere Port to the north of Chester, or to the communities of Miston Springs and Tinker Lane in North Nottinghamshire. And of course, yesterday I was in the High Court. It was an interim hearing pending a full substantive hearing, but it's just an interim hearing to decide under what terms the injunction imposed at a secret hearing by Justice Morgan back in late August, what terms should be maintained or modified pending the substantive hearing, and the dates also being set for the substantive hearing. So yesterday's hearing was presided over by Judge Zaccarini, and I have to say he appeared to take all of the evidence in a very fair way, but unfortunately when it came to his judgment, he simply rubber stamped the order that had been put in place by Justice Morgan. He afforded me an appropriate amount of time to express my opposition to the injunction being continued to the extent that it is, and that is that basically my case was that iGas have no possibility of returning to Ellesmere Port before the substantive hearing. They don't actually have planning permission to go back to Ellesmere Port and do what they want to do, which is basically flow testing from the shale. And of course, I did take the opportunity to flag up that iGas don't actually have permission for the well that they have at Ellesmere Port. They have permission for a 900-metre exploratory well through the coal measures to look at the prospect of getting a flow of coal bed methane. But they accidentally drilled an extra 1,046 metres going well into the shale. And of course, we have a piece of video footage of John Blaemyers, the Chief Operations Officer of iGas, actually bragging that they have significant core samples from the shale, despite not having any permission to actually drill into the shale. So consequently, I was making the observation that, on the basis they have no permission to go back there and so won't be returning before the substantive hearing, there was no point in maintaining this draconian injunction. But Justice Zaccarini decided that, well, actually, on the basis that there's no need for the injunction, there's also no need to remove it. Interesting, of course, judicial logic. And then when we come to Tinker Lane and Miston Springs, I argued that the exclusion zones were excessive. The Miston Springs one going right to the roundabout at Blackstone, and the Tinker Lane exclusion zone going right to both the north and southern junctions from Blythe on the A1. And I said that obviously there's no evidence of any activity, any protester activity, literally beyond a few meters either side of the Bellmouth. But the IGAS legal team made representation that these are routes that are determined by the traffic management plan. Unfortunately, we didn't get an opportunity to counter that, and therefore they should be protected. So the bottom line is that as of right now, the injunction, with very minor modification, remains in place. The most significant modification is that all the named groups in the schedule on Justice Morgan's injunction, listing people who were believed to be opponents of fracking, have been removed. And I made the observation that including the community liaison groups in particular for Tinker Lane and Mission Springs had been a very significant own goal, and had certainly frustrated, to put it mildly, the members of those community liaison groups who are at least trying to work with IGAS in some way. A number of people came up from Balcombe and from Surrey, the Brockham area, to make their disgust heard at being included in the list in the schedule in the original hearing. But and they were duly represented actually by the duty solicitor at the Royal Court, and I have to say that Miss Sullivan did a pretty fair job of trying to pull together the how shall I say, the loose-knit opposition coming from Balcombe and Brockham. So this now goes to a full hearing, a substantive hearing, and this will now take place in the Royal Courts at Fetter Lane in London. So dates for your diary, and it's likely to be a 2 to 3 day hearing. So it's going to be Tuesday the 11th, Wednesday 12th, and possibly Thursday 13th of December. So as far as my challenge is concerned, the bundles are now definitive. That means there will not be any addition from my part or from IGAS's part. So I now have basically 2 months to prepare my substantive challenge to the IGAS injunction at Ellesmere Port, Tinker Lane and Mission Springs. And this is why the country is very much in the grip of a civil rights crisis. Because one of the observations I made it to the court yesterday was that people are beginning to now come to the realization that they don't live in a democracy, that the commercial courts are effectively determining what can and can't be done, and basically any anti-feeling against commercial enterprise will be literally ridden roughshod over. It is rule by critici. It's the rule by judges. And when I made that point to Justice Zaccarini yesterday, his facial expression might have just as well said, your point being? I don't think the judges have a problem with rule by the judiciary. But of course, they are in a bubble. They are living in a bubble. There we are in the heart of the city where commerce is king. And the reality is that they are not interested in the health and well-being of the people who are impacted by this industry. And of course, this is the thin end of a very, very fat wedge. Because if this occurs with fracking, then basically, of course, it sets legal precedent that can be trotted out by any industry. So, rolling the clock forward, if there is a network of deep boreholes across the north of England, then the modification to the Infrastructure Act in April 2015 gives the government permission to effectively dump anything they want down those wells without consulting with the local community. And if the local community happen to find out what's occurring and mount a robust challenge, which includes non-violent direct action, peaceful protest, which is perhaps in breach of criminal law at a low level, i.e. obstruction of the highway, obstruction of a police officer, trade union offences, maybe even public nuisance. But nonetheless, those penalties are determined by parliamentary law. Yet if the corporations decide it's not enough and they need open and free access to dump their toxic nuclear waste down the well, then any opposition will effectively be neutered through putting a draconian injunction in place. And I'm pleased to say that a few days ago, some 200 academics from Sussex University issued an open letter calling for a judicial review on the harsh sentences dished out to Rich Luzzo, Simon Blevins and Richard Roberts following their truck protest in July 2017. And they've called the sentences a dangerous precedent. And this is, of course, an absolute understatement. So it really is time to recognise that actually what we're facing here isn't just the prospect of the entire north of England being fracked into oblivion. It's also the prospect of the civil rights within this country literally being fracked into oblivion, to the point where within a few years everyone's forgotten that they ever had any right to protest. And of course the law of unintended consequences does come into play, as Cuadrilla are realising at Preston New Road, where they thought the injunction was going to be enough to prevent any non-violent direct action, but of course that's proven to not be the case. And as more and more people realise the magnitude of the threat, then I've little doubt that there will be further actions which give the finger to the injunctions. But the other effect, of course, is property prices. And I believe it was yesterday, a report was published showing that there has been a drop in house prices over the last 3 months in 2 areas of the country. Now, one is London and the immediate environs, and of course that fall in prices is basically related to the prospect of Brexit, if that ever happens. And you know, some of the internationals are leaving London and creating a bit of a glut on the property market. But the other area, coincidentally, is effectively mirroring the surface area of the Bowland Shale. And properties across the north of England fell by 1.7% over the last 3 months. Now, annualized, that's a drop of almost 10%. So that is, in my opinion, an unintended consequence, not an unsurprising consequence, because we have been flagging this up for some considerable time now. But the reality is, those people who have the misfortune to live in the sacrifice zone, if they own a property, then they are likely to find that that property is going to depreciate. And in fact, if Cuadrilla do go ahead with this frack before the end of the month, then I think we can expect to see, you know, property prices in the western area of Lancashire, around the Fylde Peninsula, fall by a lot more than 1.7% between now and Christmas. So thanks for joining me this morning. As I've said, no live stream tomorrow morning, but I will be in the studio, so you can watch the live shows either on this Facebook channel or on YouTube at the UK Column Live YouTube stream. And then I will be back with a live stream on Friday morning. But don't forget those dates for your diaries: the 11th, 12th and possibly 13th of December, when we'll be back in court making the substantive challenge to the IGAS and hopefully the Angus injunction. I hope that sometime over the next few weeks, the communities around Balcombe and Brockham can coordinate a strategy to mount a substantive challenge to the injunctions in their areas, just as we're mounting that challenge for Earlsmere Port, Miston Springs and IGAS and Tinker Lane. And my thanks to the community, particularly at Miston Springs, who have offered absolutely tremendous support in bringing about this challenge. So thanks for joining me today, and I will, if I don't see you tomorrow evening, I'll be back with you on Friday morning. You take care now.